The central plaza of Vaco City gleamed under the triple suns of Teresia, its polished obsidian surface reflecting the assembled crowd like a dark mirror. Commander Julian Reeves adjusted the environmental controls on his exosuit, still uncomfortable with Teresia's higher gravity and copper-rich atmosphere. After 3 weeks on this alien world, he should have been acclimatized, but today something else made his chest tight, the spectacle unfolding before him. Rising from the plaza's center stood an ancient execution device, modernized with energy fields and quantum-locked restraints, but unmistakable in its purpose. A guillotine, elegant and terrible, its blade shimmering with a monomolecular edge that could slice through virtually any material in the known galaxy. "You understand, Commander, that justice on Teresia must be visible to all," said Magistrate Dorn, his translucent facial membranes pulsing with what Julian had come to recognize as satisfaction. The magistrate's four-fingered hand gestured toward the platform. "The terrorist Nixara has caused the deaths of hundreds. Her public execution will restore order." Julian swallowed hard, maintaining the neutral expression that 16 years in the diplomatic corps had perfected. "I understand your customs, Magistrate. However, the Interstellar Coalition still hopes negotiations might." "Observe, human," Dorn interrupted, his voice dropping to a reverent hush as the crowd parted. Guards dragged a figure onto the platform. Even in chains, she moved with a fierce dignity that commanded attention. Nixara stood nearly 7 feet tall, her scaled skin shifting between deep violet and midnight blue under the sunlight. The intricate bioluminescent patterns along her arms, marks of her warrior lineage, flashed with defiance. Julian had reviewed her file extensively. Leader of the Liberation Front, mastermind behind the attacks on government storage facilities, responsible for exposing the ruling council's hoarding of medical supplies during the Crimson Plague. The official reports labeled her a terrorist. The underground networks called her a hero. "Nixara of the Eastern Reaches," announced a court official, voice amplified across the plaza. "You have been found guilty of treason, insurrection, and murders against the sovereign state of Teresia. Do you request mercy before execution?" Nixara raised her head, silver eyes scanning the crowd until, surprisingly, they locked with Julian's. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, though they had never met. "I request nothing from tyrants," she replied, her voice rich and melodic despite the translator's mechanical rendering. "My only regret is leaving my work unfinished." The magistrate signaled, and Nixara was forced to her knees, head positioned beneath the blade. Julian felt his diplomatic training crumbling as the executioner took position at the control panel. "Magistrate," Julian said urgently, "the coalition cannot support this action if you proceed." "Your coalition has no jurisdiction here, Commander. Watch and learn how Teresia handles those who disturb the peace." The executioner pressed the sequence. The blade hummed as it rose higher, gathering energy. Julian had spent his career choosing words carefully, navigating the delicate balance between worlds. But in this moment, words failed him. Before his conscious mind could intervene, he was moving through the crowd, pushing past guards too surprised to stop him. "Hold," he shouted, leaping onto the platform and positioning himself between Nixara and the descending blade. "By Article 7 of the Interstellar Diplomatic Code, I claim protective custody of this prisoner." The blade froze mid-descent, suspended by emergency protocols that recognized the diplomatic override in Julian's exosuit transmitter. Silence fell over the plaza. Nixara looked up at him, confusion and wariness battling in her expression. "What are you doing, human?" she whispered. "I'm not entirely sure," Julian admitted quietly, his heart pounding as guards surrounded the platform. "But I couldn't watch them execute you." The magistrate's voice cut through the silence, high and outraged. "This is an outrage. Commander Reeves has violated our sovereign laws. Arrest them both." Julian helped Nixara to her feet, nodding the way she winced as she stood. They had hurt her during interrogation. "Stay close to me," he murmured. "You realize you've just made yourself an enemy of the entire Teresian government," Nixara said, a hint of incredulity in her voice. Julian smiled grimly as he assessed their rapidly diminishing options, watching guards close in from all sides. "It wouldn't be the first time I've derailed my career for a cause I believe in." A hint of something, respect, perhaps flickered across Nixara's alien features. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Because sometimes, Julian said, activating his emergency beacon and drawing the small diplomatic sidearm he was permitted. Justice matters more than protocol. The first shot he fired was aimed at the control panel, overloading the system. The blade crashed harmlessly to the ground as chaos erupted in the plaza. In the confusion, Julian grabbed Nixara's arm. "If you want to live to continue your fight," he said, "then run with me now." For a moment he thought she might refuse. Then her hand clasped his, scales cool against his skin. "Lead the way, Commander," she said. "It seems we now share the same enemies." Together, they plunged into the panicked crowd, two fugitives from different worlds, bound by a single impulsive act of defiance that would change both their destinies forever. The back alleys of Vaco City were a labyrinth of shadows and light, narrow passageways where the triple suns barely penetrated. Julian pulled Nixara behind a waste reclamation unit as a patrol of security drones buzzed overhead, their scanning beams sweeping the ground below. "Your diplomatic immunity," Nixara whispered once the drones had passed, her silver eyes reflecting what little light filtered down. "It's revoked now, isn't it?" Julian nodded grimly, checking the power level on his sidearm. "The moment I interfered with your execution, I became persona non grata." He managed a wry smile. "The coalition ambassadors will be writing strongly worded disavowals as we speak." Nixara's bioluminescent markings pulsed with what Julian was beginning to interpret as curiosity. "Yet you did it anyway. Humans are more impulsive than our records suggest." "Not all humans," Julian replied, cautiously peering around the corner. "Just the ones foolish enough to think they can change things." For the first time, a sound escaped Nixara that his translator identified as laughter, a rolling, melodic trill. "Perhaps we have more in common than I thought, Commander." They moved deeper into the industrial sector, avoiding main thoroughfares. Julian's diplomatic knowledge of the city was proving useful, but not comprehensive enough. They needed local help. "We need to get these restraints off you," Julian said, eyeing the quantum cuffs still binding her wrists. "And find a way to mask your biosignature. They'll be scanning for your specific genetic profile." Nixara nodded toward a decrepit building ahead. "The establishment with the red glow, it's a repair shop run by a sympathizer, mechanic named Torvak." Julian hesitated. "You're sure we can trust them?" "No," she admitted, "but Torvak owes me a life debt. Among my people, that still means something." Inside, the shop was cramped with salvage technology, a testament to Teresia's strict resource allocation laws that made new parts almost impossible to obtain legally. The proprietor, a hulking Teresian with faded scales and one cybernetic eye, recognized Nixara immediately. Without a word, he ushered them into a hidden back room. "I heard the sirens," Torvak rumbled, his translator struggling with his dialect. "They say a human diplomat has kidnapped the great Nixara." His good eye swiveled to Julian, assessing. "They did not mention he would be so small." Julian had grown accustomed to being considered diminutive on Teresia. "Size isn't everything," he replied. Torvak made a sound like grinding gears, their equivalent of a chuckle. "No, sometimes it is the small creatures that carry the deadliest venom." He turned to Nixara, producing a device that hummed with energy. "Hold still, Commander." With surprising delicacy for his massive hands, Torvak deactivated the restraints. Nixara rubbed her wrists, the patterns on her arms flaring briefly before dimming to a low pulse. "We need disguises, transport beyond the city walls, and weapons," she said. Torvak nodded. "For you, anything, but it will take time, perhaps an hour. Rest here." He gestured to a small adjoining room before leaving them alone. The space was clearly designed for Teresians, with strange angles and furnishings too large for human proportions. Julian sat awkwardly on the edge of a resting platform, finally letting exhaustion wash over him. "You're injured," Nixara observed, moving closer to examine a gash on his forehead he hadn't even noticed in the chaos. "It's nothing," Julian said, but didn't resist when she reached for a small medkit on the wall. "Hold still," she instructed, applying a cooling salve to the wound. Her touch was lighter than he expected, her scaled fingers leaving a tingling sensation on his skin. "The interrogators," Julian said quietly as she worked. "What did they do to you?" Nixara's expression hardened. "Nothing I wasn't prepared for, nothing compared to what they've done to others." Their faces were close now, her alien features somehow becoming more familiar with proximity. Why risk your life for your people? You could have escaped off-world, lived safely elsewhere. Her hands paused. Teresia is my home. Its people are my blood. What is safety if purchased with the suffering of those you love? She studied him with those mesmerizing silver eyes. What about you, Commander? Family waiting for your return to Earth. Julian, he corrected. And no, my parents died years ago. The diplomatic corps became my family. A family that will now disown you, she said softly. He shrugged. Maybe, but I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd stood by and watched them kill you. Something shifted in her gaze, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit across the gulf of their different species. Then we are both orphans now, Julian, cast out for our principles. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had words for yet. Then Torvak returned, bearing disguises and news of a transport leaving for the outskirts in 20 minutes. As Julian donned the oversized Teresian worker's garment that would partially conceal his human features, he caught Nyxara watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. I'm still trying to decide, she replied, if you're the luckiest or unluckiest human in the galaxy to have crossed my path. Julian smiled. Ask me again if we survive the night. Her bioluminescent patterns rippled in what he was beginning to recognize as amusement. Fair enough, Julian of Earth. The night is still young and the path ahead dangerous. What neither said aloud was that, against all odds and reason, neither would choose to walk it alone. Dawn broke across Teresia's horizon with an explosion of crimson and gold as the system's three suns rose in staggered formation. Julian watched the spectacle from their makeshift camp at the edge of the Razorback Mountains, a range of jagged stone formations that resembled the spine of some enormous beast. It's beautiful, he murmured to himself, momentarily forgetting the danger that had pursued them through the night. Beauty and danger often walk hand in hand on our world, Nyxara said, appearing silently beside him. She'd been scouting ahead while he recalibrated his exosuit to withstand the harsher environment outside the city. The atmospheric radiation during triple dawn can cause hallucinations in unprepared human neural systems. Julian chuckled. Is that your way of telling me not to stare at the sunrise? The corners of her mouth twitched in what he now recognized as her version of a smile. It's my way of saying I'd prefer not to carry you if you start believing you can fly. They had escaped Vaco City aboard a waste reclamation vessel, hiding among discarded technology bound for the recycling outposts. Torvak had equipped them with survival gear, weapons, and most crucially, a biosignature scrambler that masked Nyxara's distinct genetic pattern from government scanners. The rebel outpost is 3 days' journey through the mountains, Nyxara said, kneeling to study a digital map projected from a small device on her wrist. We'll need to avoid the main passes. Since your intervention at my execution, they've doubled patrols. Julian moved closer, studying the topography. And this route, he pointed to a nearly invisible line threading through the most rugged terrain. The path of ancestors, few know of it, fewer still dare to travel it. Dangerous. Her silver eyes met his. Extremely, but not from government forces. They broke camp efficiently, erasing all traces of their presence. Julian was beginning to appreciate Nyxara's methodical nature, the way she moved with calculated precision. She was a warrior born, but also a tactician, her reputation among her people well earned. The path of ancestors proved aptly named. Ancient stone markers carved with symbols Julian's translator couldn't decipher lined their route through narrow ravines and across precarious natural bridges. By midday, the triple suns beat down mercilessly, and Julian was grateful for the cooling systems in his exosuit. Your people built this path? He asked during a brief rest, sharing water from a canteen Nyxara had filled at a hidden spring. Not built, found. She traced one of the symbols reverently. Before the current regime, before the resource wars, my ancestors followed these markers on spiritual journeys. They believed this path connected the physical and spiritual realms. Julian was struck by the tenderness in her voice, a sharp contrast to the hardened rebel leader he'd first encountered. You still believe that? I believe, she hesitated, searching for words. I believe there are forces beyond our understanding, whether we call them spiritual or scientific matters little. They continued in companionable silence until dusk approached. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, forcing them to climb near-vertical rock faces. Julian's diplomatic training had included basic physical preparation, but nothing like this. Halfway up a particularly treacherous section, his foot slipped. For one heart-stopping moment, he dangled by his fingertips, the ground dizzyingly far below. Then a strong hand gripped his wrist, and Nixara hauled him up with seemingly effortless strength. "Thank you," he gasped, pulse racing as they reached a narrow ledge. "We're even now," she said, but the concern in her eyes belied her casual tone. "Rest here, we'll make camp in that cave ahead." The cave provided welcome shelter as temperatures plummeted with nightfall. Julian managed to activate a small heating unit from their supplies, while Nixara secured the entrance with proximity sensors. "You said we're even," Julian observed as they shared a meager meal of nutrient bars. "But I don't see it that way." "No," her head tilted in curiosity, bioluminescent patterns shifting to deep blue. "You would have found another way to escape execution. I've read about your previous escapes. You're resourceful." She laughed softly. "Perhaps, or perhaps fate brought you to that plaza at precisely the right moment." "You believe in fate." "I believe in patterns that are sometimes too complex for us to perceive." She moved closer, studying him intently. "What I don't understand is why. You had a successful career, privilege, safety. Why risk everything for a rebel you'd never met?" Julian stared into the glow of the heating unit, searching for the right words. "When I was a child, my parents were humanitarian workers on Proxima IV during the drought crisis. Local officials were hoarding water, letting people die. My father spoke out, organized protests." He paused, old wounds reopening. "They executed him for sedition. My mother died trying to save him." Nixara's markings pulsed with sympathy. "And when you saw me on that platform?" "I saw history repeating itself. I couldn't stand by, not again." She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "So your impulse wasn't so impulsive after all." "I suppose not." Without warning, the cave's darkness was pierced by the shrill alert of the proximity sensors. Nixara moved with lightning speed, drawing her weapon and extinguishing the heating unit. "Patrol drones," she whispered. "Stay back." Through the cave entrance, Julian could see flying machines scanning the mountainside with sweeping blue beams. One approached their location, hovering just outside. Nixara aimed her weapon, but Julian touched her arm. "Wait, let me try something." From his diplomatic pouch, he retrieved a small device, a transmitter technically only meant for emergency communications with coalition vessels. "What are you doing?" Nixara hissed. "Creating a distraction." With practiced fingers, he reconfigured the transmitter to emit a specific frequency, then sent a short burst of data. The effect was immediate. The drone's scanning pattern changed, its beam focusing away from their location toward a distant ridge. One by one, the patrol units redirected their search. Nixara stared at him with newfound appreciation. "You reprogrammed their search parameters." Julian shrugged modestly. "Diplomatic transmitters have certain encryption privileges. I may have misappropriated them during my training." Her laughter was unexpected, rich and genuine. "Julian Reeves, I'm beginning to think there's more to you than protocol and politeness." "I'll take that as a compliment." The temperature continued to drop as night deepened. Despite the heating unit's reactivation, the cold permeated the cave. Julian found himself shivering despite his exosuit's efforts. "Your system isn't calibrated for mountain nights," Nixara observed. She hesitated, then moved closer. "Teresians generate more body heat than humans, we can share." Before Julian could respond, she settled beside him, her tall frame curving protectively around his. The effect was immediate, radiant warmth emanating from her scaled skin. "Better?" she asked, her voice close to his ear. "Much," he admitted, acutely aware of her proximity, the subtle scent that reminded him of cinnamon and something alien but pleasant. "In the rebellion," she said quietly, "we survive by trusting each other, by remembering that despite our differences, we need one another." Julian felt her arm tentatively drape across his chest, a gesture both protective and questioning. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand over hers, feeling the smooth texture of her scales against his palm. "Different species, same principles," he murmured. "Maybe that's enough." Her bioluminescent patterns dimmed to a soft glow that pulsed in rhythm with what he imagined was her heartbeat. "Maybe it's more than enough," she whispered. In the darkness of a cave on an alien world, pursued by enemies on all sides, Julian felt something unexpected taking root between them, something that transcended diplomatic relations and political alliances. Something neither of them had words for yet, but both recognized with equal measures of wonder and trepidation. When morning came, they continued their journey, but something fundamental had shifted. Their glances lingered longer, their hands found reasons to touch when passing supplies or navigating difficult terrain. The path of ancestors was leading them not just to a rebel outpost, but toward an uncharted territory neither had expected to explore. The rebel stronghold of Karazak wasn't what Julian had expected. As they crested the final ridge, he found himself looking down at a thriving village nestled in a hidden valley, terraced gardens climbing the slopes, irrigation channels gleaming in the midday sun, and structures built of local stone blending harmoniously with the landscape. "This is your rebel base?" Julian asked in wonder. Nixara's expression softened. "This is what we're fighting for, not just resistance, but a different way of living. The way Teresia was meant to be before the resource cartels took control." As they descended, Julian noted defense systems cleverly integrated into the natural surroundings, energy shields disguised as terraces, weapons emplacements that resembled rock formations. Their arrival triggered a perimeter alarm, and a welcoming party formed at the village entrance, carrying weapons and eyeing Julian with suspicion. At the front stood a Teresian male with deep azure scales marked with elaborate bioluminescent patterns. "Nixara," he clasped her shoulders in greeting. "Word reached us of your execution. We feared the worst." "It seems reports of my death were premature, Vexer," she replied. Her markings flashed in a pattern Julian couldn't interpret. Vexer's gaze shifted to Julian, his expression hardening. "And you bring a human to our sanctuary, not just any human, a coalition diplomat." "This is Commander Julian Reeves," Nixara said, positioning herself protectively. "He saved my life, placed himself between me and the execution blade." "Or perhaps," came a new voice as a younger Teresian with a prominent facial scar pushed forward, "for coalition intelligence gathering. How convenient that a diplomat suddenly develops a conscience." Julian recognized him from intelligence briefings, Malakar, Nixara's lieutenant. "If I wanted to infiltrate your movement, there are easier ways than publicly committing diplomatic treason," Julian said calmly. Malakar's hand moved to his weapon. Maybe execution was too quick a death for a spy. "Enough," Nixara commanded, her markings flaring intensely. "Julian is under my protection. My life debt is to him now." Vexer nodded gravely. "A life debt is sacred, but caution is necessary in times of war. The human will be granted sanctuary, but under observation." Julian was escorted to a small dwelling at the settlement's edge by a young Teresian named Tarika. "Is it true what they say," she asked, "that you stood beneath the blade for her?" "Yes." "Why, our intelligence suggests your career trajectory was promising." Julian considered his words carefully. Sometimes you encounter a moment of such clear injustice that standing aside isn't an option anymore. As evening approached, Julian noticed a gathering forming in the village center. Teresians assembled around fires burning in ceremonial patterns, while drummers played haunting rhythms on hollow stone instruments. Nixara approached, wearing formal indigo robes that complemented her scale coloration. "Come, join us. This is the ceremony of return, traditionally performed when warriors return from battle." "Is my presence appropriate? I noticed Malakar doesn't exactly welcome me." "You fought alongside me. You've earned a place in the ceremony." In the center of the gathering, Vexer addressed the crowd, speaking first in the native Teresian language before switching to the common language for Julian's benefit. "Nixara has returned to us from the shadow of death. With her comes one not of our blood, but who has proven himself through action. The human Julian Reeves placed his life at risk for one of our own. Tonight, we invoke the ritual of shared flame." Nixara squeezed Julian's arm. "It's a simple ritual. Just follow my lead and touch the sacred flame when I do." She stepped forward toward a fire burning with an unusual blue-green hue, extending her hand into the flames. When she withdrew her hand, the flame clung to her skin without burning her. Julian followed suit, surprised to find the flame felt cool to the touch. When they joined their flame-covered hands, the fire intertwined and shifted to a vibrant purple that illuminated the gathered faces. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. "It means," Vexor announced, "that the flame recognizes a true bond between you. Your spirits are aligned in purpose. The human Julian Reeves is granted the status of battle companion to Nixara." The ceremony continued with feasting and music, though Julian noticed the rebels remained divided in their acceptance of him. Malachar and his followers made their disapproval evident by leaving early. "You've created quite the political situation," Julian observed to Nixara as they sat slightly apart from the main celebration. "Politics has always been as much a part of rebellion as fighting," she replied. "Don't worry about Malachar. His suspicion keeps us safe, even when it's misplaced." Later that night, Julian found himself at the highest point of the settlement, gazing at unfamiliar stars. He heard soft footsteps and knew without turning that it was Nixara. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the rebellion with us?" She settled beside him, her ceremonial robes exchanged for simpler attire. "Tomorrow, the council meets to discuss strategy. With my execution revealed as a failure, the government will intensify their hunt for us." She turned to face him fully. "As for us, that depends on what you want from your new life." "When I stepped onto that platform, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I just knew I couldn't watch an injustice and do nothing. Now I want to help your people win their freedom." And after, her voice softened, "The coalition won't take me back, and I'm not exactly built for Teresia's environment long-term." Her hand found his in the darkness. "There are solutions to environmental incompatibility if one were motivated to find them." Julian felt his pulse quicken at the implication. Is that what this is? Finding solutions together? Instead of answering, she leaned closer, her hand tracing the contours of his face. "Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures," she murmured, "as are Teresians." With deliberate slowness, Nixara closed the distance between them. Their lips met, alien yet somehow perfectly right. When they finally parted, Julian found himself speechless. "Was that too forward, Commander?" she asked, a teasing note in her voice. Julian laughed softly. "In diplomatic terms, I'd call that a successful first contact protocol." She rose, drawing him to his feet. "Come, tomorrow will bring many challenges." At his quarters, they paused. "Your people still don't fully trust me," Julian observed. "Trust is earned slowly here, but you've made a good start." Her markings shimmered in the darkness. "I trusted you with my life at the execution. Now I trust you with much more." Their lips met again, more urgently this time. The physical differences between their species faded into insignificance compared to the connection between them. Her scaled skin was warm against his, alive with subtle pulses of bioluminescence that responded to his touch. "Stay," Julian said simply. After a moment's hesitation, Nixara nodded, following him inside. In privacy, they explored each other with wonder and growing passion, human and Teresian, diplomat and rebel, finding unexpected harmony in each other's arms. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Julian traced the intricate patterns on her arm. "Of all the diplomatic postings I've had, I never imagined this one would change everything." "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Not for a moment," he replied without hesitation, "though I wonder what happens next." Nixara's hand found his in the darkness. "We adapt, we explore, we find our way forward together." Dawn broke over Karazak, its 3 suns casting multiple shadows across the rebel stronghold. The war chamber, a natural cave expanded to serve as the rebellion's strategic center, buzzed with tension as the council gathered around a holographic projection of Vaco City. "This is madness," Malachar growled, stabbing a finger at the capital's defense grid. "A direct assault on the government complex would be suicide." "Not if we coordinate with the other resistance cells," Nixara countered. "The failed execution has created instability. Now is the time to strike." Julian had spent the past week studying the rebellion's structure, and he could no longer remain silent. "Your greatest weakness isn't your numbers or your weapons," he said, stepping forward. "It's your disunity." All eyes turned to him. After the shared flame ceremony, most rebels had accepted his presence, if not his counsel. "The government keeps power by exploiting divisions between factions," Julian continued. You have cells operating in 6 different regions, each with different tactics and priorities. And what would you suggest, diplomat? Malakar's tone made the title sound like an insult. A unified coalition, Julian replied. Not just military coordination, but a shared vision for Teresia's future that all factions can support. Every successful revolution I've studied had 3 components: military strength, popular support, and a compelling vision for what comes after. Vexer nodded slowly. The human speaks wisdom. Our ancestors taught that a tree with divided roots cannot withstand the storm. I propose a summit, Julian said. Representatives from every faction meeting to draft a charter for Teresia's future. Show the people what they're fighting for, not just what they're fighting against. And you would facilitate this summit? Malakar asked skeptically. Julian met his gaze. I've spent my career building bridges between worlds. Let me build one between your factions. After heated debate, the council approved the plan. Within days, representatives from all resistance groups arrived in Karazak. Julian applied every diplomatic skill he possessed, mediating tense negotiations and finding common ground. His status as an outsider proved advantageous. He had no historical allegiances, no clan biases. The mining clans will never accept agricultural authority over resource distribution, a grayscale delegate argued during a particularly tense session. Then create a balanced council with equal representation, Julian suggested. No region or clan should dominate. Slowly, a framework emerged, a vision for a democratic Teresia with distributed power and resource equality. Julian worked tirelessly, often with Nixara at his side, drafting documents late into the night. You've given us something we've never had before, she told him one evening, her markings pulsing with admiration. Unity of purpose. The government won't surrender power willingly, Julian warned. No, she agreed, her expression hardening. Which is why tomorrow we begin the revolution in earnest. The rebellion launched coordinated actions across the planet. Julian, despite having no military training, found himself in the command center with Nixara, coordinating communications between factions. His diplomatic encryption knowledge proved invaluable for secure transmissions. Eastern mining outpost secured, reported a rebel commander over the comm system. Minimal casualties. Southern agricultural domes encountering heavy resistance, came another report. For 3 days, the rebellion advanced steadily, capturing key resources and infrastructure. The government responded with increasing brutality, bombarding civilian areas that supported the rebels. They're getting desperate, Nixara observed grimly as reports of atrocities filtered in. But losing public support with every attack. On the 4th day, intelligence arrived that changed everything. The High Council is evacuating to their orbital platform, Tarika reported, rushing into the command center. They're abandoning the capital. They'll regroup and return with orbital bombardment capabilities, Malakar warned. We need to strike now before they escape. Nixara studied the tactical display. Our forces are spread too thin. We need to pull units from multiple fronts to mount an effective assault on the spaceport. Which would leave those regions vulnerable, Julian noted. Unless what? Malakar demanded. Unless we convince them the assault is coming from somewhere else. Julian turned to Nixara. Your government ministers think like bureaucrats. They'll follow predictable patterns when threatened. We can use that. A daring plan took shape. Using Julian's knowledge of diplomatic protocols, they crafted false intelligence suggesting the rebels would attack the government's secondary evacuation route. As predicted, the High Council diverted their security forces, leaving their actual escape path vulnerable. It's time, Nixara announced, strapping on her combat gear. I'll lead the strike team. Julian reached for a weapon. I'm coming with you. No, she said firmly. You've done your part. This requires combat experience you don't have. I didn't come this far to watch from the sidelines, he insisted. Besides, if we capture council members, you'll need someone who understands interplanetary diplomatic procedures to prevent off-world intervention. After a tense moment, she nodded. Stay close to me. The assault on the spaceport unfolded with precision. Rebel teams disabled security systems, while Nixara's strike force penetrated the main terminal. Julian stayed behind her, witnessing firsthand the warrior that had earned her legendary status. They reached the council's private hangar just as the ministers were boarding their shuttle. In the ensuing firefight, Julian took a grazing shot to his shoulder but managed to seal the hangar doors, trapping the council inside. "Surrender," Nixara commanded, her weapon trained on Magistrate Dorn, the same official who had presided over her execution. "We will never negotiate with terrorists," Dorn spat, even as his fellow councilors dropped their weapons. "Then it's fortunate we're not terrorists," Julian said, stepping forward despite his injury. "We represent the United Teresian Coalition, a legitimate political entity with a ratified charter." Dorn's face contorted with rage. "You, the human who started all this." "No," Julian corrected him. "You started this when you chose tyranny over justice. I'm just helping finish it." Within hours, news of the Council's capture spread across Teresia. Government forces, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered in most regions. By nightfall, the capital was under rebel control, and Nixara addressed the planet from the government broadcast center. "Today marks not an ending, but a beginning," she declared, the newly ratified charter displayed beside her. "The dawn of a free, united Teresia governed by consent rather than coercion." Julian watched from the sidelines, his shoulder bandaged, his heart full. In the weeks that followed, a provisional government formed according to the charter's principles. Julian's diplomatic expertise proved invaluable in establishing relations with off-world entities, including a cautious coalition that viewed the revolution with concern. "The coalition wants to send a formal diplomatic mission," Julian told Nixara one evening as they stood on the balcony of what had once been the magistrate's residence. "They're offering official recognition of the new government." "And have they asked you to rejoin their ranks?" she asked, her markings pulsing with subtle anxiety. Julian smiled. "They have, with a promotion even. Apparently my unconventional approach to the Teresian situation has impressed certain admirals." "And what did you tell them?" Her voice was carefully neutral. He turned to face her fully, taking her scaled hands in his. "I told them I'm already engaged as Teresia's ambassador to the coalition, if the provisional government approves my appointment." Her markings flared with joy. "A diplomatic solution to our interspecies situation." "Well, I am a diplomat," he replied with a grin. "Finding elegant solutions is what I do." "Is that all you're proposing? A professional arrangement?" Her silver eyes studied him intently. Julian reached into his pocket, producing a small object crafted from polished Teresian crystal and earth metal, a ring designed to fit her larger, scaled finger. "I was hoping for something more permanent. On Earth, we have a tradition." Before he could finish, she pulled him close. "On Teresia, we have a saying, 'What the flame has joined, let no force divide.'" Their lips met as the triple suns set over a free Teresia, casting long shadows across a world forever changed by a single act of courage. A human who stepped between a blade and an alien, and in doing so, found not just a cause, but a home.